What happens when an ancient idea survives for thousands of years, but the way we understand it changes completely? Today, if someone says the word worship, many of us immediately think of music, a song, a congregation singing, a worship leader, perhaps a guitar, a piano, or a choir, maybe even lights, screens, and a carefully created atmosphere. But was worship originally about music? Or did the word mean something much larger? To answer that, we have to go back, not to the modern church, but to the ancient world. In the Hebrew Bible, one of the principal words for worship is shachah. It means to bow down, to prostrate oneself, to show homage. The Greek word proskuneo carries a similar sense. Another word, latreia, points towards service. These words suggest something important. Worship was not primarily something people watched. It was something they did. And more importantly, it was something they did in response to who God was. Consider Abraham. In Genesis 22, Abraham takes Isaac toward Mount Moriah. When he tells his servants that he and Isaac are going to worship, what follows is not a musical service. It is an extraordinary act of trust and surrender. Or consider Jacob. He is fleeing from his brother when he falls asleep at Bethel and experiences a vision of heaven. When he wakes, he says, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it." His response is awe. He builds an altar. He makes a vow. Again, worship begins with something God has revealed. Moses experiences something similar at the burning bush. He encounters divine holiness and removes his sandals. Mary of Bethany offers an expensive perfume to Jesus, and in Revelation, the elders fall before God's throne and cast down their crowns. Different people, different circumstances, different forms, but the same underlying movement. God reveals. Human beings respond, and that response involves reverence, surrender, sacrifice, and obedience. The Bible eventually pushes the idea even further. The prophets warn that outward religious acts mean little without an obedient life. To obey is better than sacrifice, says Samuel. Micah asks what God really requires, not thousands of sacrifices, but justice, mercy, and humility. And in the New Testament, worship becomes even less confined to a sacred location. Jesus tells the Samaritan woman that true worshipers will worship in spirit and truth. Paul describes offering one's entire body to God as a living sacrifice. Hebrews connects worship with praise, but also with doing good and sharing with others. The implication is striking. Worship is not merely something that happens during a religious service. It can become a way of living. But if that was the original idea, how did worship come to be so closely associated with music? The answer is not that Christianity suddenly abandoned its original meaning. The history is much more complicated. The earliest Christians often gathered in homes. They prayed, they read scripture, they shared meals, they broke bread, they sang. As Christianity became legal in the 4th century, worship moved into large public buildings. Over centuries, elaborate liturgies developed. Music became increasingly specialized. In some medieval settings, trained choirs performed while ordinary worshipers had a more limited role. Then the Reformation changed the balance again. Reformers such as Martin Luther encouraged congregational singing in the language of ordinary people. Hymns became a major way of teaching theology while allowing the congregation to participate. Later, evangelical revivals moved worship beyond churches. Camp meetings and revival gatherings used simple, memorable songs that large crowds could easily sing. Then came another major turning point. In the 1960s and 70s, the Jesus movement brought contemporary musical styles into Christian worship. Acoustic guitars and simple praise choruses became increasingly familiar. The intention was not necessarily to make worship entertaining. For many, it was an attempt to make Christian worship understandable and accessible to a new generation. The pattern continued. By the 1980s and 90s, worship bands became increasingly common. Printed hymnals gave way to projected lyrics. And as churches became larger, technology became more important. Sound systems, large screens, professional musicians, stage lighting, eventually live streaming and global worship recordings. Why did this happen? Partly because the culture changed. Partly because churches were trying to reach people who found traditional forms unfamiliar, and partly because technology made new forms of participation possible. A giant congregation cannot function acoustically like a small room. A screen allows thousands of people to follow the same words. Professional sound makes music intelligible. Lighting can help direct attention. Modern production can remove practical barriers that earlier generations simply did not face. So something was gained. Contemporary worship made participation accessible to people who might never have connected with older forms. It gave new generations a musical language through which they could express faith. It allowed Christian worship to travel through recordings, television, and eventually the internet. And for many believers, it became a genuine and deeply personal form of devotion. But something else may have changed. The environment surrounding worship began to resemble the wider culture of entertainment and consumption. Modern life increasingly competes for our attention. Our phones, streaming platforms, social media, advertising, everything is designed to hold our focus. Novelty matters. Anticipation matters. Experience matters. And churches exist inside this culture too. Some contemporary churches even use market research to understand what would make unchurched people more comfortable. That may have lowered unnecessary cultural barriers, but it also introduced a new possibility. What happens when the person attending worship begins to think like a consumer? Did I enjoy it? Did I feel something? Was the music good? Was the atmosphere powerful? Was the experience meaningful to me? These are not necessarily wrong questions. Emotion is not the enemy of worship. Beauty is not the enemy. Technology is not the enemy. Even excellence can be an act of devotion. The danger begins only when the experience becomes more important than what the experience is supposed to point toward. C.S. Lewis arrived at an interesting insight when thinking about praise. He realized that praise is not merely something we add to enjoyment. When we genuinely encounter something beautiful or valuable, praise naturally follows. We see a magnificent landscape, and we say, "Look at that." We hear extraordinary music, and we want to tell someone about it. Lewis argued that praise does not merely express enjoyment, it completes it. Perhaps that helps explain worship. The question is not whether worship should make us feel something. It should. The deeper question is what our feelings are responding to. Are we responding to the music, the atmosphere, the community, or to the God the music is meant to help us recognize? And perhaps this is where the history of worship leaves us with an unexpected conclusion. We do not necessarily need to return to ancient forms. The cathedral does not automatically produce deeper worship. Neither does the guitar. The hymn is not automatically sacred. Neither is the worship song. A traditional service can become performance. A contemporary service can become genuine prayer. The form alone cannot answer the question. What may be worth recovering is not an old style, but an old orientation. The understanding that worship begins not with what we create, but with what we have encountered. God reveals, we respond. God gives, we surrender. God is worthy, we praise. And perhaps that meaning can survive every technological change. So the question for our time may not be, should worship be traditional or contemporary? Perhaps the more important question is this: when the music stops, when the lights go out, when the screen disappears, when there is no atmosphere left to create, does worship continue? Because if worship was always more than a song, then perhaps the real measure of worship is not what we experience inside the church. It is what we become outside it. And that leaves us with one final question. If worship was originally a response to the presence, character, and worth of God, then in a culture increasingly designed around our attention, our preferences, and our experience, have we changed what worship is? Or have we simply forgotten what it was always asking of us?